Good morning, everybody, and welcome again to Wings of Faith Ministries and today's morning coffee and a thought. You know, one of the aspects of existence here on this planet is suffering. Suffering is inherent in human existence. It's not talked about much in pulpits, especially in evangelical churches. But we know as human beings, we suffer in many areas of life, and it can come to us in many forms. Of course, physical pain, mental anguish, anxiety, grief over loss of loved ones. It comes in many forms. In the scriptures, especially in the New Testament, there is a lot said about suffering, but two terms that come together, especially in the Gospel of John and again in the writing of 1 Peter, are the terms of suffering and glory. And so we want to tackle that issue. Why would suffering and glory be in the same paragraphs and concepts? First of all, we want to remind you that Morning Coffee and a Thought can be seen every Friday at 1 p.m. on our YouTube channel, and every Sunday morning on our Facebook page between the hours of 8 and 9 in the morning. And we hope you will join us. Also, if you have a prayer request, you would like information, or you'd like to make a donation to this ministry, you can do all of that at wingsoffaithministries.ca. If there was anyone who knew all about suffering, it had to be the Apostle Paul. In the book of 2 Corinthians, in the 11th chapter, Paul lays out for the Corinthian church all his life's endeavors and sufferings. Paul, and many people don't realize this, was confined in prisons for almost half the time that he was involved in ministry. He lays out for the Corinthians that 5 times he received 39 lashes from Jews. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was stoned once and thought that he had been left for dead. He also had shipwrecks where he was left in the open sea. He tells the church that in his travels, he was always in danger from bandits, of course, that would lay in hiding on roads you would travel. And along with all of this, he had the anxiety of the churches he had founded all over the Roman Empire. Paul knew all about suffering. And yet, the same Paul who went through all these trials and tribulations is also the same Paul that brought us 13 letters of the New Testament. He is the predominant writer of the New Testament and lays down many of the foundational truths that we accept in Christianity. Glory and suffering. Jesus talked about this in the Gospel of John. Philip and Andrew had come to Jesus as he was entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And they told Jesus that there were Greeks who were looking for him. The fact that it was Greeks that were coming to him now made Jesus reflect on the hour that was coming upon him. And he said to Philip and Andrew and to those around him that if there's only a single seed, that's all there can ever be is a single seed. But if a single seed dies and germinates, it can transform itself into many seeds. Jesus said to them that he was coming to his hour of suffering. And he said, "Father, what shall I say? Should you save me from this hour?" No, it was for God's glory that he faced that hour. You see, When suffering comes to us, it does a whole lot of things to our mental frame and our physical body. When suffering comes, our mind begins to focus totally on what we're going through. And many times God seems to be far away. All you have to do is read the Psalms of David. When David went through his trials and tribulations, many times in those Psalms, he would say, God, where are you? Are you hiding your face from me? A whole lot of changes comes to our body and our minds when we're faced with physical or mental suffering. But here's the truth of it. In 1 Peter, Peter says that in the midst of our suffering, that is where the glory of God can be revealed. What do we mean by the glory of God? That means God's presence being manifested around us and through us. Many times, because we're so focused on what we're going through, we do not realize that in reality, the presence of God is very strongly with us, and God's glory can be manifested both in the suffering and what that suffering can achieve when we hit the other side of it. Jesus' suffering on the cross led to a tremendous outcome, God's love and salvation to all mankind. In other words, something was accomplished through that suffering. That's what Peter talks about in 1 Peter. He talks about the fact that suffering produces and enhances the glory of God in our life and in our situation. There's one particular incident in Paul's life that comes to my mind, and that's in Acts chapter 27. Paul had appealed to Caesar to enable himself to escape accusations from the Jews and being taken back to Jerusalem, where they were waiting to ambush him to kill him. And so Paul now had to take a journey to Rome to make his appeal to Caesar. But it's the voyage he takes that I want to focus on. The voyage happened in the fall of the year, a bad time for sailing. And yet, the ship's owner and the pilot of the ship were determined that these prisoners, along with Paul, and the cargo was going to make it to Rome before winter closed in. They managed to get to the island of Crete, and it's there Paul feels that they should end the voyage right there and winter there for a time being. But the owner of the ship and the pilot are determined they're going to make it to Rome. They start sailing when all of a sudden a giant storm, a nor'easter, as it was called, came down off the island. The ship now adrift at sea for over 14 days. These men, including Paul and Luke, had totally given up any hope of being saved. Talk about suffering. Paul knew all about it. And then on the 14th day, an angel appears to Paul and tells him that God is going to save his life and the lives of the 276 who were on board with him. Paul faces the crew and the people to tell him what that angel spoke to him that night. Miraculously, the sailors find that they're approaching an island. They put the anchors down, and they said they just wished for daybreak. And finally that daybreak came, and they find themselves on the island of Malta. All 276 are saved. The glory of this story is that after 14 or 15 days of utter terror in a horrible storm, Paul and his companions end up ministering to the people on the island of Malta, healing them of diseases, including the governor of the island's father-in-law. The glory of God revealed in the midst of suffering. I close today with a story that we are well aware of, back in the Old Testament, the story of Job. Job had 18 months of suffering, lost his family, lost his property and his goods, and then broke out in boils all over his body. But when the 18 months was over, Job came to this realization after God had spoke to him about his circumstances. He said to the Lord, "Before this all happened to me, I had only heard about you. But now, after going through this, I see you." God's glory can be revealed in human suffering. Suffering is hard. It's not ever easy. But God's presence and his glory can certainly be manifested during our times of suffering. 1 Peter talks about that. And it changes us at the end of the day. We are never the same people when the suffering is over as we were before it began. That's my thought this morning. I pray that if you are going through a time of suffering, that this would encourage you that God has not left you, nor has he hid his face from you. In fact, he may be closer to you than in any other time in your life. There's no other time to reach out to him, sense his presence, seek his wisdom, keep putting one foot before the other. And God, at the end of it all, you'll see the glory of God manifested in your life. Have a good week, a good day, and we'll see you next week.